Hi, I'm Susan Lewis from WRTI, and I'm here with Steve Zohn and Heather Miller-Lardin. They have a new album out called Music for a Viennese Salon. Welcome, Steve and Heather.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thanks,
having
Susan.
us.
Now, Steve is a flutist and professor of music at Temple University. Heather is an early bass specialist, is that right?
That's right.
And director of Temple's early music ensemble. They are co-directors of the ensemble Night Music, which focuses on music of revolutionary and romantic eras. And Music for a Viennese Salon is their first album. Exciting.
It's very exciting. It's been a long time coming as well.
Oh, really? So talk a little bit about how this ensemble came to be, because you both play with a lot of ensembles. Why did you form this particular ensemble?
Well, Steve and I have been, as you said, playing together for a long time in various different ensembles, most of which have been Baroque music based. And we found around, I think it was 2014, 2015, that there were a number of players in the area that were interested in classical music on period instruments. And we both have always wanted to form an ensemble, and we saw that there were enough people to do it with. So we just jumped on it.
You're saying that you wanted to play different repertoire. Is that right?
Yes. So Baroque repertoire would go up until about, I mean, we draw the line kind of at 1750, but it wasn't as if people woke up that day and said, oh, well, music has changed completely today. We're going to do something different now. It's kind of an overlap period from around 1740-ish through, what would you say, Steve, 1760, 1765?
That seems about right.
And then, and you see things develop over time, which we'll get into as we talk about the album. For example, Carl Ditters von Dittersdorf, who wrote the viola and violone duet that we perform, was really known for his development of the string quartet and the symphony, as well as opera that he did. But it didn't sound all of it like we're used to sounding today. We talk about those genres as being the standard is Mozart and Haydn, but there was a lot of weird stuff going on before that and during that as Haydn and Mozart were developing. And in fact, that's just the kind of weird music we like to play.
Okay, well, how did this particular album come to be? Steve, you wrote program notes, and it looks as if it's based on the story about one evening in Vienna.
Right. Well, the three pieces on the album we had performed individually on concerts, and when we were thinking about an album repertory, we thought of these three pieces together being different in certain ways and similar in others, but they were all kind of pieces that might have been performed in a home. So we got the idea that this could be sort of almost like a recreation of a salon performance, let's say in Vienna in 1801, you know. So we thought that this was a program that would hang together with that theme.
Wait, so the story that you have in the program notes is it's not based in fact.
No, the people are real. The circumstances are sort of made up. So in other words, these three pieces could have been performed together in a salon concert in 1801 in Vienna, but as far as we don't know that they were. But you know, the Arnstein Palace was real. There were salons there. Carolina Pickler was a novelist, and she had her own salons, and all of the musicians were top musicians in Vienna. So I just took these characters and stuck them together and said, well, this is what they did one afternoon in Vienna.
That is so interesting, because I thought it reads like a short story.
I thought it was really fun.
Yeah.
Well, I've sort of been getting into historical fiction lately. And so I thought, rather than just, you know, your typical program notes, it's like, here's a piece, let's talk about it for a little bit, and here's another one. I thought it'd be more interesting to make a story. Of course, some people may not realize that I made it up, so I don't want to mislead people, but you know, it's a little more engaging, I think, to imagine that this was an actual concert.
I think it's also the way that we try to present our performances, that we like to play in smaller spaces such as the Powell House in Old City. And the audience is really close to you, and there's often people that you know, friends and family, and it's very intimate and delightful.
That's really interesting. So Caroline, how do you pronounce her last name? Pichler?
Pickler, yeah.
Pickler. So Caroline Pickler
Hmm.
was a real person. And
Yeah.
what made you decide to tell the story through her perspective?
Um, well, the fact that she was also a salon hostess and she studied a little bit with Mozart means that she would have been, a likely person to attend a salon, but also to hold one. I'm not sure where I got the idea that she would be the visitor, but I thought, well, here's a woman who's hosting a salon and another woman visitor. Um, it was a place where women really shined. Most of these salons were hosted by women, and there's not many facets of life at the time that you could say that about, I think. So that's an interesting sort of side note.
Okay. So now, how did you decide how did the music evolve in this album? Because it's very interesting. You have chamber music that you speak of as almost symphonic, and
Mhm.
symphony orchestrated for chamber ensemble, and then another piece right in the middle. How did you decide to put that all together? Did it grow from one piece, or did you kind of see how they all fit together from the start?
I think it was definitely the Haydn. Am I right about that, Steve? Is that how
Yes,
you
I think
felt?
so.
We
Yeah.
it is just such an exquisite arrangement. It has everything in it, and it's so compact, and it's really really fun to play. And we just thought we'd build an album around that.
Okay. And it's interesting because the surprise symphony, part of the surprise comes when you hear an orchestral performance comes from the volume and the dynamic. So would this have been performed by a chamber ensemble?
Absolutely, it was made to be played at home. And so the people listening would be a very small group gathered around you. And I think it was one way, because you couldn't turn on a CD, you couldn't turn on the radio, you had to have somebody play it. And they knew what was coming. They knew what the surprise was, and they could make that happen on a smaller scale in a smaller room.
Cool. And so then what was the next piece that you put with it?
Well, once we decided on the Haydn, the Krauss quintet has the same scoring. So, a part of it is a practical matter where you have to keep your players busy. I mean, the players who are available, then you select the repertory. And so we thought, well, this is an interesting pairing because this is really it's not an arrangement of an orchestral piece, yet it has the same scoring as that arrangement.
Well, almost.
Almost the same. Um, uh, well, and
Well, actually,
we decided to add violone to both because neither score calls for violone. So we sort of reinforced the bass line with Heather playing at various times, which was our own artistic license, so to speak.
so in the 18th century, double bass was prominently featured in chamber music, as in the Dittersdorf duet, but it wasn't something that composers always turned to, especially in genres like this. But if there was one around, for example, in Schubert's Trout Quintet, he wrote it because there happened to be that combination of players where he was going to be that weekend. Then you could put it in, and they might jump in. And one of the things that I did was I reduced the parts. So if the bass line needed a little bit of something, but it was too heavy, I might play it pizzicato, or I think I did that in some of the variations in the Haydn. And
Mhm.
then I might just play a note here and there, or not all of them. So that was our concession.
Well, that's really interesting. So you have these two was it correct to say they're two larger works, the
Mhm.
Haydn and the Krauss, and then in the middle you have a duo. So Heather, talk a little bit about that, and talk a little bit about your instrument.
Okay, my instrument is a sort of specialized double bass that has 5 strings, and it uses a tuning that's a little higher than most double basses are tuned today. It was tuned in uh, fourths with a third in the middle. And today's double bass is tuned generally in fourths down a little bit lower. I won't go into the details of it, but it was meant to have a very bright sound, and it was a very popular instrument in the late 18th century, very early 19th century, and then fell out of favor because there were some things that made it not so useful about that tuning. And it's actually not the star of this duetto by Dittersdorf. The viola player really has the brunt of the work. It's very demanding, and our violist, Dan Eliar, did a crackerjack job of it. There's a lot of double stops. There's a beautiful melody in the adagio, and some fireworks in the final movement. So I really need to give him credit for that.
So musically, does this tell a story?
I think we hope the diversity of the program, tells a story of the kinds of music making you would hear in a salon or just anyone's home. I think none of these pieces were really meant for the concert hall. Of course, the symphony is transformed into a domestic piece by this arrangement. But we also noticed that because the Krauss and the Haydn are scored similarly, and yet are different kinds of pieces, it kind of tells an interesting story. It makes you think about how an orchestral piece can somehow seem like a chamber piece. And Krauss writes his piece in orchestral ways sometimes. The flute comes in the first movement as if it's a wind section, and then it switch rolls and becomes like a concerto soloist. And in other times, it just becomes part of the ensemble again. So I think Krauss is playing with this big ensemble. He's playing with this idea of chamber versus orchestral kind of music. And to some degree, Haydn does that too in all of his symphonies. There's a lot of solo writing for winds, and that's only highlighted in the chamber, the chamber arrangement that we do. So it made us think about the line between chamber music and orchestral music, which can be very fine in certain pieces. So
this album seems to be able to be appreciated on multiple levels. You can appreciate it on the beauty of the music. I've been listening to it, and it's great. It's great to listen to, especially during this time. I don't know. It's really, it sort of pulls you into its mood. And also, I think the history of it and what purpose music served for people then versus now. Have you thought about the significance of this kind of music to our times today?
I think for me, when we're actually performing it, it has to be something that's pretty close up, as I mentioned earlier. And I think being that close to your audience and being able to interact with them, not just while you're performing, but on a social level, before, during, and after, I think is something that's really important about this kind of music. And that's what's meaningful about it to me right now.
Right. And what can you say what draws you to play this music on historic instruments?
Personally, I love the sound of gut strings. I think it's really warm and inviting, and it's resonant, and technically it's just fun to make those sounds. There's something very tactile about it. I can't speak to the wind instruments though.
Well, I think the music for me makes more sense on these instruments. The balance seems right. I always thought when I was playing the modern flute that it didn't blend very well with string instruments. It just sort of stuck out too much. Whereas the classical flute that I'm playing on this recording just seems to blend so beautifully, and its volume is not a problem. So there's that, but also just the way that the instruments respond seems very well suited to the music. So you're not fighting the instrument to produce the effect you want. It's just kind of more of a natural thing.
Can you point to any particular parts of this album that listeners should pay close attention to?
Well, I could talk about particularly the minuets in the Dittersdorf and the variations. There are some effects on my instrument that involve what we call bariolage, crossing strings quite a bit, and some chords, which are really idiomatic to the Viennese double bass. Steve, anything from the Krauss?
Well, I was thinking that all three pieces have variation movements, and they're all very, very different. You know, Haydn has a very well-known variation movement, the slow movement, with the surprise, um, and the Krauss has a beautiful variation movement as well that's a little bit um, unconventional in its structure, I would say. And then there's the Dittersdorf as well. So this was a really common thing in the classical period. But if you really want to hear how the different composers, how the three composers differ in their approach to one kind of movement, that might be an interesting thing to focus on.
If someone picks up this album who is not familiar with early music or music done on historical instruments, what would you want them to get? What message would you want them to take away from it, listening to this?
I think the fact that we're playing period instruments is simply an artistic choice, and I don't think it should matter to anyone that's listening whether or not we are. I think if we can be expressive as musicians, and this is how we choose to do it, that's what I want them to walk away with, that they felt the energy that we're trying to project with, especially I'm thinking of the Haydn Symphony. It's just pure joy, which we all need right now.
Absolutely. Steve, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say, the instruments we play are just our tools. And I wouldn't want people to listen to it and say, oh, that's a performance on period instruments. I want them to think, wow, these are really interesting performances of interesting music. That's the main thing.
So what does this music, is there possible to say what this music means to you? Like if you run into someone and say, you have to listen to this because.
Well, I'll talk about the Krauss because it's a piece that I always wanted to play for years. And we first played it, I think, in 2015 in a concert. But I've always admired that composer, who's not as well known as he should be. His dates are almost exactly Mozart's, so you can imagine it's easy to get overshadowed by Mozart. But he was a real original composer who had interesting things to say, and this is one of his best chamber works, I would say, and it's deserves to be a standard repertory piece, but for whatever reason hasn't become one yet. So I would say, these are all great pieces to listen to, but the Krauss may surprise you if you've never heard of this composer.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Congratulations on the album. And it's
Thank you.
great to talk to you.